Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western Literary Canon out loud. Today we are completing the other half of Journal Collection number 52, dating from the year 1861. We are up to March 31st of that year, and I will start with the entry for that date. Yesterday, March 30th, at the club, which now numbers 20, Agassiz, Appleton, Cabot, Dana, Emerson, Forbes, Hawthorne, Hedge, Hoare, Holmes, Howe, Longfellow, Lowell, Motley, Norton, Pierce, Sumner, Ward, Whipple, Woodman. We had present 12 members, and as guests, Mr. Bruce of New York, Mr. Couthey, Mr. Rouse. We might call our age the age of Renaissance. We have recovered the Elgin marbles, Nineveh, the pyramid frescoes, Cicero de Republica, the Tischendorf manuscript, the Champollion inscriptions, Giotto's head of Dante, Milton's Christian doctrine. Reading of papyri, publication of Sanskrit Vedas, 25,000 years old. The forms and faces of the people of Pompeii buried in the ashes of Vesuvius, the accurately determined age of men of the Stone, Bronze, and Iron Ages. The lacustrine remains, the insight into mythology, alike everywhere in its element. Recovery of antique statues. Reconstruction of the ground plan and elevation of temples which war, earthquake, and iconoclasts of all creeds had not been able to utterly disintegrate. April. Editor's note. Beginning early in the month, Mr. Emerson gave a course of lectures in Boston. 1. Genius and Temperament. 2. Art. 3. Civilization at a Pinch. This no doubt was specially adapted to the new and hopeful conditions, for the war had begun that promised to solve the distressing problems of the last few years. 4. Some good books. 5. Poetry and Criticism in England and America. 6. Boston. Abstracts from the manuscripts of some of these lectures remaining are found in Mr. Cabot's memoir, Appendix F, but a large part of the matter is incorporated in essays later printed. End of note. April 5th. When somebody said to Reverend Dr. Payson, "How much you must enjoy religion, since you live always in administering it," he replied that nobody enjoyed religion less than ministers, as none enjoyed food so little as cooks. Bishop Clark of Rhode Island told of a dispute in a vestry at Providence between two hot church members. One said at last, "I should like to know who you are." "Who I am?" cried the other. "Who I am? I am a humble Christian, you damned old heathen you." One capital advantage of old age is the absolute insignificance of a success, more or less. I went to town and read a lecture yesterday. 30 years ago it had really been a matter of importance to me whether it was good and effective. Now it is of none in relation to me. It is long already fixed what I can and what I cannot do. Great are the benefits of old age. See Swift's letter on old age. Also, old age is frowsy. Old men are drunk with time. The brook sings on, but sings in vain, wanting the echo in my brain. In youth the day is not long enough. I well remember my feeling, say in 1823 or 1824, that a day of 18 hours would accommodate my plans of study and recreation much better than our poor Copernican astronomy did. Pliny says, quote, "And luxury ceases not to busy itself, in order that as much as possible may be lost whenever a conflagration happens." Bond's translation, Volume 6, page 221. April 18th. Art. Yesterday I read my lecture on art. I add, there are as many orders of architecture as creatures, or tenets, or reasons for erecting a building. A seashell, a bird's nest, a spider's web, a beaver's dam, a muskrat's house, a gopher's, a rabbit's warren, a rock spider's silver counterpane over its eggs, a cocoon, a woodpecker's hole in a tree, a field mouse's gallery, wasp paper, a beehive, a lamprey's pyramid are examples, so a tree, so the shape of every animal, is the structure, the architecture which nature builds for a purpose, which rules the whole building and declares itself at sight. Boys. I delight to see boys who have the same liberal ticket of admission to all shops, factories, armories, town meetings, caucuses, mobs, target shootings, as flies have, and I desire to be saved from their infinite contempt. If I can pass with them, I can manage well enough with their fathers. May 3rd. Wednesday, I read my lecture on good books to the class. An affecting incident of the war occurred on the arrival of the 5th Regiment of Massachusetts at Springfield, received with such enthusiasm by the people that a funeral procession passing by stopped and joined in the cheers with which the troops were hailed. See Boston Journal of Tuesday, April 23rd. The National Intelligencer says of the arrival and performance of the Massachusetts 8th Regiment at Annapolis that probably no other regiment in the country could do what this regiment did: put a locomotive together, lay the rails on the broken railroad, and bend the sails of a man of war, the frigate Constitution, which they manned. Men delight in being well governed. When two men meet, one of them usually offers his vacant helm to the hands of the other. The country is cheerful and jocund in the belief that it has a government at last. The men in search of a party and dispositions that could not fuse for want of some base, all joyfully unite in this great northern party on the basis of freedom. What a healthy tone exists! I suppose when we come to fighting, and many of our people are killed, it will yet be found that the bills of mortality in the country will show a better result of this year than the last, on account of the general health. No dyspepsia, no consumption, no fevers, where there is so much electricity and conquering heart and mind. So in finance, the rise of wheat paid the cost of the Mexican War, and the check on fraud and jobbing and the new prosperity of the West will pay the new debt. May 25th. Read Doctrine of Leasts at Mrs. Parkman's. Should have cited, but did not, Swedenborg saying, "To construct a philosophy is nothing more than to give the best attention to the operations of one's own mind." Swedenborg said, "Touch apprehends the surfaces of parts, taste and smell the surfaces of parts of parts. Everything is a series and in a series." Swedenborg. Hell itself may be contained within the compass of a spark. Thoreau. Use the low style, build low. Mr. Downer said the Snuggeries in Dorchester kept their tenants. The airy houses on the hills soon lost them. I have heard that Colonel Wainwright, was it, or what gay gentleman, took Alston out to ride one day. Alston painted out of that ride 3 pictures. Faraday's subjects were a tea kettle, a chimney, a fire, soot, ashes, etc. Remember nature's low fare system. Southerners do not shrink from the logical construction of their premises because it is immoral. Neither will they shrink from the practical result because it is degrading. Quote, "Short is the date of all immoderate fame. It looks as heaven our ruin had designed, and dared not trust thy fortune and thy mind." End quote. Dryden. Our horizon is not far, say 1 generation or 30 years. We all see so much. 'Tis an inestimable hint that I owe to a few persons of fine manners, and still is impressive, when I now rarely see them as of old. July. Editor's Note. On July 10th, by invitation of the students, Mr. Emerson gave an address at Tufts College. Most of the matter is printed in the centenary edition of the works only, under the title Celebration of Intellect. See Natural History of Intellect, pages 111 to 132. Mr. Cabot gives an abstract in Appendix F of the memoir, pages 780 to 782. End note. The Southerners cannot sufficiently express to Mr. Russell their contempt and detestation of the Northerners. Meantime, they are carefully sending their wives and children to the Northern States for protection during the war. Quote, Dante is picturesque, for he is an outward world where he feels forms as persons, and while he feels as a child in a company, he only affirms facts, rather than meets the idea as Goethe does. He tells how nature has acted toward human persons who are forms, and he sees the power as lights of them as we do in life, and describes them as forms and in the places which give us the fact. Milton is picturesque in a grander and less outward manner, because he gives us character, though generally and outwardly, so individually, and then the editor says word omitted, to the forms of Satan and Eve. C. K. Newcomb. He basked in friendships all the days of spring. You have power or taste, but taste is power passive or feminine, and every one has some. Take your stereoscope among your acquaintances and see how many find delight in it. Try on the new poem and see how many it will fit. Notable persons. People receive as compliment the freedom of cities. 'Tis a sham gift, like so many of our doings. The personage 'tis likely who receives it is some poet or some politician. What freedom will it give him? Not of the river, for he cannot swim or row, not of the woods, for he is no hunter, and looks on the woods as a place to be avoided, not the hills, he has not the least inclination to climb barren mountains. I cannot see that the freedom of such a town as ours can be given to any adult who does not possess it already. But they who have the freedom of the town are the boys who use the brook, the pond, the river, the woods, the cliffs, the wild orchards, and huckleberry pastures. The misfortune of war is that it makes the country too dependent on the action of a few individuals, as the generals, cabinet officers, etc., who direct the important military movements, whilst in peace the course of things is the result of the movement and action of the great masses of citizens. August 5th. The war goes on educating us to a trust in the simplicities and to see the bankruptcy of all narrow views. The favorite pet policy, a district, the épicier party of Boston or New York, is met by a conflicting épicier party in Philadelphia, another in Cincinnati, others in Chicago and St. Louis, so that we are forced still to grope deeper for something Catholic and universal, wholesome for all. Thus war for the Union is broader than any state policy or tariff or maritime or agricultural or mining interest. Each of these neutralizes the other. But at last Union party is not broad enough because of slavery, which poisons it, and we must come to emancipation with compensation to the loyal states, as the only broad and firm ground. This is a principle. Everything else is an intrigue. I wrote to Cabot that, huge proportions as the war had attained from despicable beginnings, it is felt by all as immensely better than the so-called integrity of the Republic, as amputation is better than cancer, and we find it out by wondering why we are so easy at heart in spite of being so beaten and so poor. A rush of thoughts is the only conceivable prosperity that can come to me. Hodson's life, like this war, this teaching war, is a good chapter of the Bible which the nations now want. Self-help. Trust against all appearances, against all privations, in your own worth, and not in tricks and plotting. Lose the good office, lose the good marriage, lose the coveted social consideration that seem within your reach if they do not constitutionally belong to you, but must be won by any shadow of intrigue, any departure from that utterly honest, solid, and venerable self-existency which you are. Honor shall walk with me, though the footway is too narrow for friendship or success, or what is called power, and the great sacrifices which directly become necessary in such a resolution force us on new and grander thoughts, open the eyes to all angels who attend us in phalanxes. All the pleasure and value of novels is in the exhibition of this poetic justice, the triumphs of being over appearance. In talking with Alcott of ontology, etc., I said that a few people were entitled to make the catalogue of the powers and the order of Genesis, that the great primal powers will not sit for their portraits, and are ever melting into each other, dodging, one might almost say, behind each other, and it is only a Plato, a Bacon, or a Kant that may presume to rank them, nor he but delicately and diffidently. Alcott said, yes, he must make up a ladder of lightning, and efface all the steps as he passed up or down. There is always a larger consideration just ahead, which the mind can be stimulated to apperceive, and which is the consolation and the energy which in dullness and despair we need. If we Americans should need presently to remove the capital to Harrisburg or to Chicago, there is almost nothing of rich association with Washington City to deter us. More's the pity, but accepting Webster's earlier eloquence, as against Hayne and John Quincy Adams's sublime behavior in the House of Representatives, and the fine military energy of Jackson in his presidency, I find little or nothing to remember. It seems that I should like to have the statistics of bold experimenting on the husbandry of mental power. In England, men of letters drink wine; in Scotland, whiskey; in France, wine; in Germany, beer. In England, everybody rides in the saddle; in France, the theatre and the ball occupy the night. In this country, we have not learned how to repair the exhaustions of our climate. Is the sea necessary in summer? Is amusement, is fishing, is bowling, hunting, jumping, dancing, one or all needful? Tristram took care to fight in the hours when his strength increased, for from noon to night his strength abated. Resources. If you want Plinimon in your closet, Carillon, Provence, Ossian, and Cadwallon, tie a couple of strings across a board and set it in your window, and you have a wind harp that no artist's harp can rival. It has the tristesse of nature, yet at the changes a festal richness ringing out of all kinds of loftiness. Sounds of the animals and of the winds, waters, and forests are for the most part triste. Whippoorwill, owl, veery, nighthawk, cricket, frog, and toad, but the thrush, song sparrow, oriole, bobolink, and others are cheerful. Sir Robert Wilson wrote, I transmit a piece of my new order ribbon. It is not beautiful, but it becomes so when cannon smoked. Bonaparte knows that every Frenchman is a soldier in 6 weeks, an advantage not appertaining to any other state. Every bullet has its billet, but the men must have shoes. The British nation is like old Josiah Quincy, always blundering into something good. There are limits beyond which France cannot be beat back, and it is the part of a statesman to ascertain those limits and not to force down public spirit to that point where the bounding spring destroys the hand that so unskilfully compressed its elastic power. Sir Robert Wilson. The war is a great teacher, still opening our eyes wider to some larger consideration. It is a great reconciler, too, forgetting our petty quarrels as ridiculous. Quote, on such a shrine, what are our petty griefs? Let me not number mine. But to me the first advantage of the war is the favorable moment it is made for the cutting out of our cancerous slavery. Better that war and defeats continue until we have come to that amputation. I suppose if the war goes on, it will be impossible to keep the combatants from the extreme ground on either side. In spite of themselves, one army will stand for slavery pure, the other for freedom pure. Fama bella stant, Quintus Curtius, which translates in the footnote as, wars hold their own through fame. The fortune of Bonaparte turned. There is only one that is strong and unfailing, God, nature. General causes, if you wish to veil the power under neutral names. A nation never falls but by suicide. Bonaparte conquered by using sense against nonsense, direction against indirection, geometry against red tape, nepotism, feudality. But presently he adopted falsehood, red tape, nepotism, and it became a question of numbers, and down he went. I am at a loss to understand why people hold Miss Austen's novels at so high a rate, which seems to me a vulgar in tone, sterile in artistic invention, imprisoned in the wretched conventions of English society, without genius, wit, or knowledge of the world. Never was life so pinched and narrow. The one problem in the mind of the writer in both the stories I have read, Persuasion and Pride and Prejudice, is marriageableness. All that interests any character introduced is still this one. Has he or she the money to marry with, or conditions conforming? 'Tis the nympholepsy of a fond despair, say rather of an English boarding house. Suicide is more respectable. September 1st. When the troops left at Fort Hatteras wake up the next morning, they look out at their conquest with new eyes. If their commander knows what to do with it, the feeling of victory continues. But if not, they already are the timorous, apprehensive party. A day in Carolina or elsewhere is a splendor of beauty and opportunity to a rational man. To an ox it is hay, grass, and water. 'Tis heavy to an idle, empty man, for it will defeat him. The physician, if he apply blister or external inflammation, gives a drop or pill internally for the sake of reaction. And a day is an inflammation of nature, which requires an idea or purpose in the man to counteract. In the midst of stupendous difficulties, Napoleon is cheerful and fat because he sees clearly what to do and has it to do. September 9th. Last night a pictorial dream fit for Dante. I read a discourse somewhere to an assembly, and rallied in the course of it to find that I had nearly or quite fallen asleep. Then presently I went into what seemed a new house, the inside wall of which had many shelves led into the wall, on which great and costly vases of Etruscan and other richly adorned pottery stood. The wall itself was unfinished, and I presently noticed great clefts intended to be filled with mortar or brickwork, but not yet filled, and the wall which held all these costly vases threatening to fall. Then I noticed in the center shelf or alcove of the wall a man asleep, who I understood to be the architect of the house. I called to my brother William, who was near me, and pointed to the sleeper as the architect, when the man turned and partly arose and muttered something about a plot to expose him. When I fairly woke and considered the picture and the connection of the two dreams, what could I think of the purpose of Jove who sends the dream? My long-sought story I find in Joinville, Histoire de Saint Louis. Quote, whilst the king was at Acre, the Sultan of Damascus sent him messengers and complained to him much of the emirs of Egypt who had slain his cousin, the Sultan, and promised the king that if he would aid him, he would deliver to him the kingdom of Jerusalem which was in his hand. The king decided that he would make answer to the Sultan of Damascus by his own messengers. With these messengers went Friar Ives, the Breton of the order of preaching friars, who knew this arsenic. During their sojourn at Damascus, as they were going from their hotel to the hotel of the Sultan, Friar Ives saw an old woman who traversed the street and carried in her right hand a vessel filled with fire, and in the left a vial full of water. Friar Ives asked her, "What will you do with that?" She answered him that she would, with the fire, burn paradise, and with the water, extinguish hell, that it should no longer be. And he asked her, "Why do you wish to do thus?" "Because," replied she, "I wish that no one henceforth should do good to have paradise for a recompense, nor through the fear of hell, but purely for the love of God, who is so mighty and can do all good to us." What inspiration in every assertion of the will! Thus I find a stimulus in the first proposition of political economy. Everything in the world is purchased by labor, and our passions are only causes of labor. Hume. Adam Smith's first proposition is, that all wealth is derived not from land, but from labor. Then again, how can I read without new courage this sentence? That security which the laws in Great Britain give to every man, that he shall enjoy the fruits of his own labor, is alone sufficient to make any country flourish, notwithstanding these and 20 other absurd regulations of commerce. Editor's note. On September 27th, Mr. Emerson gave an address on education before some literary society in Yarmouth. It is mostly printed in Education, lectures and biographical sketches. End note. October. Lately I find myself oft recurring to the experience of the partiality of each mind I know. I so readily imputed symmetry to my fine geniuses on perceiving their excellence in some insight. How could I doubt that Thoreau, that Charles Newcome, that Alcott, or that Henry James, as I successively met them, was the mastermind which in some act he appeared? No, he was only mastermind in that particular act. He could repeat the like stroke 1,000,000 times, but in new conditions he was inexpert, and in new company he was dumb. The vice in manners is disproportion. 'Tis right that the hearth be swept, and the lamps right, but never interrupt conversation, or so much as pass between the faces of the inmates to adjust these things, for you lose the end in the means. Every one has a new scale, and many tones are wanting in each. You shall not tax a man as frivolous because you find him amusing himself with young people. The question is, through what length of scale does he run, and where does he lay the emphasis? The revolving light resembles the man who oscillates from insignificance to glory, and every day and all his life long. So does the waxing and waning moon. The man who can make hard things easy is the educator. Whatever is dreary and repels is not power, but the lack of power. Eloquence is the art of speaking what you mean and are. Before all things stand enchanted, not tangible. He comes and touches them, and henceforth anybody may. Always let nature and reality, and not you, be at the expense of entertaining the audience. Editor's note. On November 12th, Mr. Emerson gave a lecture on American Nationality in the fraternity course in the music hall. Mr. Cabot gives an abstract of what was said in Appendix F of the memoir, page 783. The tone is hopeful. On December 29th, Mr. Emerson read the lecture Immortality in the same course, printed in Letters and Social Aims. On a Sunday at some time between these two lectures, he read a discourse, Truth, before the Parker congregation. This also in abstract appears in Appendix F, pages 784 and 788. End note. All greatness is in degree, and there's more above than below. Good of evil. Give you a public not easily pleased, a pruner of your orations, an adversary whom you must confute and convince, and not one to whom you can dictate his opinions and his taste. Quote, more than the disciple trust I the sinner. End quote. Eastern saying. The persons generally most praised and esteemed are not those whom I most value, for the world is not receptive or intelligent of being, but intellect. But heroes are they who value being. Being cannot be told, and is left alone not only because little appreciated, but that its influence is silent and quiet. The world is awed before the great, and is subdued without knowing why. If we look at the fossil remains of the earliest men and compare them with their best races of today, we shall have a hint that the like refinement in the type is still proceeding, and that the men of today cannot be organized in a more advanced age, any more than the Saurians in the granite of Massachusetts. The homage paid to a great man is the expression of our own hope. Quote, severity is almost always a defect of memory. End quote. Gasparian. Originality. How easy it is to quote a sentence from our favorite author after we have once heard it quoted. How unthought of before. 'Tis like our knowledge of a language. We can read currently in German, But if you ask me what is German for horse or spade or pump, I cannot tell. If you see what often happens, a dull scholar outstripping his mates and coming into high stations, you will commonly find on inquiry that the successful person possesses some convivial talent, like B.S. Originality. I am not sure that the English religion is not all quoted. December. The war begins to turn, and mass to tell against activity. President Lincoln said well that the rebels, quote, carried only the ruin of their own country as ground to invoke the aid of foreign nations. How rare are acts of will! Captain Ingram became famous by taking away a subject of the United States from the Austrians to whom he was a political offender. General Jackson by, quote, assuming the responsibility, end quote, and now Commodore Wilkes by taking on his own responsibility, Mason and Slidell. Good writing, how rare! X writes affectedly or secondarily with all his talent and heat of purpose. So Kingsley and Hepworth, Dixon, and others of Carlyle's imitators. But the old Psalms and Gospels are mighty as ever, showing that what people call religion is literature. That is to say, here was one who knew how to put his statement, and it stands forever, and people feel its truth, as he did, and say, Thus saith the Lord, whilst it is only that he had the true literary genius, which they fancy they despise. In the old grand books there will be now and then a falsetto, as in the Cid, a Moor who makes a malediction on Valencia before its fall, which is inflated, has no inspiration. But the chants of Merlin or Taliesin are good. A great deal of what is called luck in literature, not only in men, but in particular works. Thus Hogg's Kilmeny. Kilmeny is a true inspiration, wonderful as a chant of Merlin or sonnets of Shakespeare, and how strange that it should have been written by such a muddlepate as James Hogg, who has written nothing else that is not second or third rate. And our Alcott, but a fruit of Connecticut, has only just missed being a seraph. A little English finish and articulation to his potencies, and he would have compared with the greatest. Under the snow, the ground is covered all winter with evergreens, though not so called, as certain grasses and cinquefoil and radical leaves of many plants, clover, whiteweed, buttercup, chickweed. Read lately Sir Robert Wilson, Max Muller, Samuel Brown's lectures, Count Agenor de Gasperin, Buckle, Volume 2. December. Intellect egotistical, or much fine metaphysics, is only exaltation of seeing farther than the rest. In Taliesin, in the Mabinogion, the man that feeds the fire under the pot is spattered with 3 drops, and his eyes are opened, and he sees the danger he is in from the witch who set him to watch the pot, and he flees. Suppose the 3 drops should spatter the crowd in the street, how many would go on to do the errand they are now running after? Old age. Age puts the stone chapel on you to lift. I ought to have added to my list of benefits of age the general views of life we get at 60 when we penetrate show and look at facts. I thought on the worldliness of London life. I most feel the heartlessness when they talk of heart, my dear fellow, etc., and their atheism when they are religious. What provision stored and storing for the boy that shall be born tomorrow? Here is Plutarch and Scott and Milton and Shakespeare waiting for him. What delicious songs, what heroic tales, what delicate fancies, how they shall fit him as if made for him only. Realism. The knowledge is in the world, but the world lives as if it were not. The knowledge is all printed fairly out in books, which are on your shelves, but you are not less astonished and angry when it is spoken in church. The knowledge is familiar to you and applied every day by you in your social relations, to your visitors, and to those who you mean shall not visit you. And you are incredulous of the reality of such potency when it is proposed to be applied in politics. Realism. Paganism conquers Christianity just as Greece, Rome. Thought last night how ill agrees this majestical immortality of our popular religion with the population. Will you build magnificently for rats and mice? What could Hanover Street do in your eternal heaven? Not once in 500 years comes a soul organized for immortal life. Time is only precious to highly organized natures. What then eternity? These we see are raw recruits, 3 months' men not to enlist for the war. Do not sweep the streets to gather members for the Academy Observatory. This is the end of Part 2 of Emerson's journal collection number 52, dating from the year 1861, when the author was 58 years old. Thank you for listening.